Okay. Welcome, folks. We'll get going in just a moment here as we get everybody woven into the meeting. As you can see from the slide, this is a meeting of the Maine Offshore Wind Roadmap Advisory Committee. Thanks for joining us today. Let's just give folks a moment to get signed in. When we start a webinar like this, it takes a moment for all the folks who are in the queue as observers to get actually connected to the meeting. So that's what we're doing right now. All right, so as we get going, my name is David Plum. If we haven't met previously, my job here is to help facilitate these meetings and related meetings for the offshore wind roadmap here in Maine. We're doing this on Zoom. This is a webinar, so we really appreciate everyone who's joining us as observers. Meeting materials are online, and I'll ask maybe Laura or Maggie if they could drop the link in the chat to where folks can find the meeting materials for today. In terms of other sort of Zoom things, the folks that you see in the screen here are members of the advisory committee or key staff. So that's who's in our Zoom room today having the conversation. With that, let me turn it over to your co-chairs, Director Dan Burgess at the Governor's Energy Office and Admiral Gregory Johnson. So Admiral Johnson, if you want to kick us off, that would be great.
Good morning, David, and fellow advisory group members and everybody else that's on this meeting this morning. We're grateful that you've taken the time to join us. And I think we have a very good agenda in front of us, and looking forward to a productive meeting and importantly having productive discussions and the input from the collective wisdom of this group. I'm sure that all of you are in good spirits, at least all of you who are members of the Red Sox Nation. And I think it was a pretty thrilling game last night, and hopefully it begins to erase or ameliorate some of the bad memories of the curse of Babe Ruth and Bucky Dent and whatever other curses there are out there associated with this kind of historic rivalry between the Boston Red Sox and the New York Yankees. And switching to more pressing issues that has to do with this offshore study. I come to this with a great deal of interest. I'm certainly not an expert in offshore wind power or energy, but in the profession I came from, we began listing climate change as a significant national security threat almost 2 decades ago. And the Navy is particularly concerned about it. As you imagine, one of the good things about the Navy, we own a lot of real estate, but most of it's on oceanfront. And for instance, the largest naval base in the world, Norfolk Naval Complexes, that whole Hampton Roads area, you know, the tallest point is about 3 feet above sea level. My first job as a flag officer was Director of Ops and Policy for the Atlantic Fleet. I took over the job in June, and that was the beginning of the hurricane season. And whenever a hurricane started flying up the Gulf Stream, we'd have to make a decision on whether we sorted the fleet. And you know, the Northeast Quadrant is the most severe. And if you were going to get everybody underway that could get underway, they had to leave at least 48 hours ahead of time to get it far enough out into the Atlantic to avoid the Northeast Quadrant of the hurricane. It cost several tens of millions of dollars every time we did that. And so spent a lot of time worrying about hurricanes and sorting the fleet that summer, and became quite passionate about it, particularly since the residence that I lived in Norfolk, we had to sandbag it about 3 times that summer. That was one of the big decisions. Do we start sandbagging everything? And they have a little 9-hole golf course where the 1908 exposition was held, the Great White Fleet, and a lot of flag officer houses there. And that whole out on the front lawn, and that whole golf course was under about 2 feet of water. We had about 1 more foot to go to get to the top of the 3-foot-high mountain that we had in the front yard. So became to it that way. And then I came back to Maine, and remember the first year after I retired in 2005, it would be about August where the water in front of my home got up to 60 degrees. The last 2 or 3 years, my grandkids are swimming out there as if it's a lake, and the water by early August is over 70 degrees. And the other way that I think I come to it is I'm a passionate fisherman, fly fisherman, and of course, the only appropriate target species for wild native brook trout and landlocked salmon. Well, pretty soon we started catching smallmouth bass everywhere. And that's just another indication of the warming water, the changes coming about by climate change. And so I have finally come to the conclusion that smallmouth bass are appropriate game fish. I'm not still so keen on largemouth bass, but that's another issue. But looking at the fish and the changes going on offshore, it's the same thing out there. And so I think that if you just look at what's going on around us and look at how the ground fishing species have changed and how that has to do with what happened to our shrimp industry and what have you. This is all related to climate change, and the only way we're going to be able to conquer this threat is to go big on renewable energy. And so I think this study is critical. I hope that we have scoped it correctly. Today, we're going to start hearing from our working groups as part of the agenda. And then we have a period of time for discussion. And the reason for that discussion is it says I'm supposed to talk about the big picture. Well, I don't have the big picture, but I do believe that this assembled group collectively has the wisdom and has a big picture. And so we want to seek some of your input to make sure that we've scoped this thing correctly, and that the information and the things that our working groups have on their agenda and are trying to sort out for us will give us the kind of science-based data that we need to achieve the outcome that we desire, which is actionable recommendations. And I think that, as you can see, the rapid pace of change due to climate change is accelerating now and catching up with us, from water shortages in the West, fires. And just this morning, I read a fascinating article about the situation in Europe, where they got ahead of themselves in this renewable energy business and started taking down the traditional methods of producing power before they had enough renewable capacity. And now they're in a real mess for this coming winter. And Germany took away 30% of its energy when it decommissioned after the incident in Japan, but they didn't have the renewable capacity on board. And of course, now they're totally dependent on the Soviet Union. So looking at these things from a strategic standpoint, how interrelated they are. And for us, if we're going to decarbonize, we've got to have renewable capacity online and operating and proven that it is a viable alternative before we can start decarbonizing both the production of electrical power, but also, most importantly, our transportation sector, how we heat our homes, and what have you. So this is critical. This is a huge opportunity for us. I think we've assembled the ways and means to come up with those actionable recommendations, but I also think that we need to start looking at this with a greater sense of urgency. And so we look forward to the reports from the working groups, and then we'll go into that discussion. And I'm really keen to hear from all of you on the advisory committee to make sure that we've asked the right questions of our working groups. Do we have enough information to make those actionable recommendations? And look forward to that input. And then we have two other things that we're going to do. We're going to discuss our plans for engaging all Mainers, which is going to be a critical part as we get further down the pathway on this and start having to engage all our stakeholders and indeed actually all the citizens of the state of Maine. And then we'll also have a discussion about equitable outcomes, which is very important. So I think that gives a rough overview of what we hope to accomplish today. And I again think the discussion following the working group presentations this morning is probably the most important thing, and we look forward to the thoughtful and collective comments from all of you. And I would, I don't know, David, where you want to go, but Dan, I would welcome any other things you might have to say about to get us going this morning.
Yes. Yeah, thanks the opening remarks, Admiral. Really appreciate the overall context and the even kind of personal context about climate change. I appreciate that. We've made the executive decision to mute all Yankees fans, so if you can't unmute, that's why. So just be aware of that. But before we get into the updates, contextually, just for offshore wind, wanted to provide a few updates about activities happening in the state. This roadmap process is 3 months into the making, and we've had a dozen meetings thereabouts. We have 2 consultants on board to provide technical assistance and to assist the working groups and the advisory committees, which is I'm excited about the work that they're doing and about the information they're going to provide. As I'm sure you've seen, we've also submitted the application for the research array on October 1st, last Friday, which is a 15.2 square mile site. Application goes to BOEM for consideration. It also includes a research framework for possible research that will take place at the array. So they have the application. There will be formal steps that they roll out, including more opportunity for public input and NEPA review. We are turning towards creating the legislatively required and called for research consortium, working on developing that, and we'll hope to have updates on that soon. We've also joined the Regional Wildlife Science Entity, which is a new organization dedicated to regional planning and coordination on ocean wildlife research and monitoring. So we're excited about that specifically for offshore wind. And then we're continuing to participate and partner with the National Offshore Wind Research Development Consortium and the supply chain and workforce assessment effort that they're undertaking with other states as well. So a lot happening in the space, both through this initiative and otherwise, and excited to get into it, and would encourage, it's not always easy over Zoom, but would encourage folks to weigh in, provide questions, discussion points as we get through the updates. So thanks everyone for all the work.
Excellent. Okay. Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Grog. Thanks to both of you. All right, so let's get into it. Admiral Johnson mentioned our work today. Let me just quick throw that up and as a slide here so you can see this is what we're trying to do today, folks. We're going to listen to the working group co-chairs. We've asked them to do 3-minute, no slides, just what's going on, what are the key issues, and then we want to have some discussion around those issues. We'll give some discussion prompts on it. Then we're going to look at this proposed structure for the roadmap and what that means for the recommendations that we're looking for coming out of working groups. And since about half of you are working group chairs, this is really important. And then we've got these 2 other issues we want to dive into around an equity framework for our work, as well as stakeholder engagement. So that's what we're doing. It's blocked for 3 hours in your calendars. We're aiming for 2 hours today. So that's our goal, to just make this a 2-hour meeting and give everybody an hour back in their schedules. Okay. So why don't we go into the first piece, which is around the working group updates. And by the way, in the chat, for those of you following along as observers, the materials that we will be using throughout today's meeting are in the link that's in the chat. So feel free to do that. Also, on the website, the MaineOffshoreWind.org website is a comment portal, which is a great way to channel comments into the working groups and into this advisory committee. So we welcome folks to use that common portal that's on MaineOffshoreWind.org. Okay, so what we've asked folks to do who are co-chairs here of the working groups is to give us sort of a 3-minute update or 3 to 5 minutes about what are the core issues that are going on right now in your working groups. Because working groups are already starting to put the building blocks of the roadmap together through their discussions, right? It's early days, but those sort of frameworks of what to talk about in these groups and what the recommendations need to focus on is happening. So we're going to start with the working group with a long name, which is Supply Chain, Workforce Development, Ports and Marine Transportation. We're going to start with that group. And I believe co-chair Steve Von Vaught is going to be able to give us our 3-minute spiel. And then we're going to have a conversation on the back end of what Steve's going to share in terms of what that working group is working on. So Steve, do you want to take it away and say what's going on in this working group? What are the core things
Sure.
that you all are working on?
Let me unmute first because things always go better when you're unmuted.
Perfect. You're good. You're good.
Well, let me just say first, we met and organized, which is no small task these days for a group this diverse, and we did it all on Zoom. We're made up of a wonderfully diverse group of existing supply chain partners and potential supply chain partners. We're very fortunate to have people with 10, 15 years of experience actually in working in offshore wind, as well as people who are just learning about what it's all about. We are interacting between the supply chain group, the ports group, and the workforce group. We have a wonderful dialogue going on where we begin to understand a little bit about each other's turf and what's going on in that space. We've also begun our first regular meetings with the contractors that are assisting us and the state, Exodus and BW. We're on a bi-weekly meeting schedule with them. We're just getting to know them. They're getting to know us. We also collected the existing resources in the state, and that would include the existing Maui database, the New England Aqua Venice database, and the MITSI database of supply chain entities in Maine. And we've compared, contrasted, and passed that lump of data on to our consultants, as well as we've shared it amongst ourselves. We were very fortunate to view what I call Supply Chain 101, a 10-minute presentation put together by our own Ben Brown, who used to run Maui, who now works for the Business Network for Offshore Wind. And it's a very useful, realistic, and a great presentation. In 10 minutes, you can become a quasi-expert in offshore wind. So I don't know how many of you have seen it. We've seen it within our group. I know it's readily available, so I would encourage David and his apparatus to make sure that it goes out so everyone can take a look at it. It was a nice piece of work and it was very informative. I would say as a group, we are looking both inward and outward. We've been around for a while, some of us, and we're looking for opportunities existing in Maine, potentially coming in Maine in our waters, but we're also looking outside of Maine to the region and ultimately to the world. We have folks within our supply chain in Maine that are working regionally. We have folks that are working globally, and we're trying to identify them and understand who's doing what. We're also looking to identify Maine's unique and competitive advantages with the existing and the nascent supply chain. We have done things here in Maine. We know how to work on the water. We've erected wind turbines. We've done all kinds of things, and I think that it's important for us to figure out as a state and an economy where we fit into both our efforts here in the Gulf of Maine and our efforts in the region and globally. Lastly, we are a little late to the party. 10 years ago, we were early to the party, perhaps too early. Now we're late. So there is an element of urgency to figure out where we as a state can play in this wonderful development that's going to go on for the next 10, 20, 30 years. So I do say there is urgency, and I think we should move as quickly as possible to explore our role here in the region and in the globe. Anything that I think Matt or Jonathan want to add that I've missed, overlooked, feel free to chip in. Maria?
That was a fantastic summary, Steve. I have nothing to add.
Great. Okay. So that's what that working group is focusing on. I dropped a link to Ben Brown's presentation in the chat if folks want to look at that later. Okay, so we actually want to pause for a second and as a advisory committee, have a quick conversation about these issues that the supply chain workforce development, ports and marine transportation group are wrestling with. We were talking ahead of this meeting, we were particularly interested in making sure we have our minds around the regional context and sort of global context in which Maine is figuring out its own path, right? And so we had some questions here that we thought would be interesting for this working group to share what they know, and for you all as advisory committee members to ask some questions and share what you know. So we'd be interested to take about 10 minutes just to talk about these questions that I threw in the chat right now. These questions are, how do the actions of other states and countries around the world and the velocity of those actions shape the type of recommendations we need to make around ports, supply chain, workforce development, et cetera, right? And are we really getting the information we need from the consultants and from the expertise we have on this working group? So I'd be interested first for folks who are members of this working group to reflect on this question quickly about, and I think Steve, you referenced it quickly, but if there's things you want to say, there's a new NREL report that came out just about a month ago with new statistics in there. Are there things that are important to put in context so that we as an entire advisory committee understand the context of the work of this working group? Steve, is there anything you want to say about that sort of regional context to give a little bit more flavor there?
Well, over the years, we have played around with all sorts of development in the state, in the niches that we have some expertise. We're not alone here up in Maine. We're very fortunate to have exports in terms of our talent, running and managing a number of the major developments elsewhere in New England. And I'm pleased to say that one of our early people started the effort in Maryland. So I think that we can both learn from what's going on in the region, but we also can learn from the mistakes that were made. And I think that it's important for us to figure out where we fit in the complex puzzle that's out there. We're a wonderfully capable state in terms of the niche skills that we have and the unique skills that we have. And we need to identify those and quickly bring them to the front so that they benefit both our own development, but also the development elsewhere in the country.
Thanks.
And I offer a chance for anyone else in our group to kick in on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And Terry, I see you raised your hand. So Terry, you want to weigh in on this?
Well, I don't know if it pertains particularly to that, David. So maybe finish this conversation. I have a question for him, but
okay, great. Hold 1 second then, Terry. I won't lose you. Keep your hand up, please. So to follow on what Steve's saying in terms of the regional context and what it means from what this working group should be working on and preparing to bring to all of you, right? Because that's what's going to happen in December, maybe into January. This working group and the others will be bringing initial recommendations to this group for you all to take a look at, to look across the working groups, to provide some feedback. What else do we need to say about the regional context? Admiral Johnson, do you want to say a word? And then Jonathan?
Well, yeah, and probably what I have to say is more observations and a fact that I have deficiencies in my overall understanding of particularly from a strategic standpoint. But what I've been able to learn is that, our energy, we're a consumer. It's not the state of Maine, it's a regional. We're operating within a regional context. ISO New England, that's where we buy our power from. And we contribute to it with assets that are here in Maine. And it's a very sophisticated way that they charge and ultimately is reflected in our energy bills. But So I don't have a good idea of the scope and scale. Like I said, what if we meet our renewable energy requirements and the region that we operate in, because we're inextricably linked to them, reach theirs, it's an immense amount of renewable energy that's going to be in place. And I think it will be by 2040 or 2050. And so if we're going to have actionable recommendations, I think we have to have some very good context on how much exactly that is. I think a good part of what the renewable is going to be offshore, and an increasingly larger portion of what is offshore wind power is going to be in so-called deep water, greater than 150 to 200 feet of water. In other words, on floating platforms. And so I just want to make sure we scope that. And then, of course, that's all irrelevant if we don't have the means to get that, what we produce, to market. And that's both transmission lines from the fields out in the Gulf of Maine into the primary transportation lines that tie into the New England grid. And as I understand it, you know, we're about a 1/15 of what New England sells comes to Maine. So we're a small part of that overall. The line that connects us, you know, south into the rest of New England is just about at capacity. And how would we get the power that is available, that sits out there every single day, if we were to harness it all, both for the state of Maine, but all of the region, because it is a regional thing. You know, where will those lines, where will they go ashore? I mean, there's obvious places like Wiscasset and Cousins Island and up. I think there's a huge line that goes down to the cement place in Thomaston. There's an access that from the paper mill in Bucksport. There's places where we could do this, but I'm not clear on that. So I think that needs to be looked at. The other thing that I'm concerned about, as I've started, is how much deep water port capacity do we need, and what is the scope and scale of that if the assets that exist out in the Gulf of Maine, the wind that's blowing out there every day, is fully realized, the potential that has. And we don't want to miss that. We don't want that port facility to be in Gloucester, Mass, or New Bedford, Mass, or some other place. We'd like that to be in Maine. We have very little industrial port capacity. We have 3,000 miles of coastline, and someone once told me we have 12 miles of industrial working waterfront in the state of Maine. It strikes me that that might not be enough to take care of the issues that to support the offshore wind. So I'm hoping that, I presume this would be your committee, Steve, that will be looking into some of these things and that help us scope this thing and understand and make the kinds of recommendations that we'll have to make for this to be a truly actionable report.
Thanks, Admiral. Yeah, absolutely. Some of these are going to be right in the squarely in the supply chain ports, workforce development, marine transportation. Other things will be more in the energy markets. We'll hear from in just a moment, whether it's transmission lines and those kinds of things. Great. Let's take a few more. I don't want to miss Terry as well, but Jonathan, go ahead, and then we'll keep going. And then, so go ahead, please, Jonathan.
Yeah. I just want to say, can you hear me?
Yeah, you're good.
Yep.
I just want to say that to address your question, and Admiral Johnson, you're fully correct of, you know, looking at our ports and any infrastructure upgrades that need to happen to the ports in order to fully realize the opportunity that exists here is certainly something that we're looking at. I think that when you look at how other states and countries are making decisions and moving forward in this industry, that's wholly influencing how we see the opportunities moving forward. Certainly there's the wind capacity in the Gulf of Maine, but outside of the Gulf of Maine, you know, we still see opportunity to participate in the industry and the developments happening elsewhere. And like Steve said, it's looking at the niche and the opportunities that Maine can provide based off our strengths and established pedigree over the last several decades that we've developed. So I think our working group fully recognizes the supply and demand and the market, overall market economics at hand here that are driving this industry and the opportunities. And of course, the threats of our neighbors to the south and to the northeast that are potentially moving faster than we are. And one of the biggest challenges, as we all know, with this industry is that it exists at the intersection of public, so the government space, the private space, and then of course the public, the overall citizens of Maine. So I think recognizing the challenges that exist in that space and how quickly we can move is certainly something that we see as a challenge, but not insurmountable, of course.
Thanks, Jonathan. That's great. Let me quickly go over to Terry and catch that. Terry, go ahead, please, about whatever you wanted to comment on.
Well, I don't know if this comment is on this particular thing, but I'm going to say it anyway. No matter what, you know me, David. So in southern New England, all the ships are foreign ships that are doing the work down there. And you know, part of this whole bring jobs to Maine thing, bring the infrastructure to Maine thing, should be coming out of this committee. I think, you know, requiring those to be U.S. flagged vessels. Is this the group that would be working on that, or do we have somebody that would be working on that?
Yeah,
I'm not sure that we have. It makes me nervous when, you know, this whole thing's funded by a foreign company and we don't have an assurance that these are going to be U.S. vessels that are here making money, putting this thing up and servicing this thing. So,
yeah, Terry, great point. And it is something that we're looking into in this working group. We're bringing in a Jones Act expert to have a conversation on the impact of the Jones Act on the industry. And then, of course, I worked down in Naval Station Norfolk prior to this, working for Military Sealift Command, which is one of the largest operators of U.S. flag shipping, and really looking at the inventory of U.S. flag ships. And it's drastically lower than others around the world. So looking at how we can improve the assets we have on hand to do this work, I think is a great question and something that we'll certainly look into.
Great. Okay. Tom, go ahead, please. Tom Welch.
Yeah, thanks. This may be implicit in what the committee chairs have indicated, but it seems to me that one of the analyses that would be very useful coming out of this working group would be some assessment of the extent to which Maine's scarce resources, however characterized, money, political will, whatever, fit into doing something that has a good chance of market success. I was struck by the comment that we may be behind the curve in some elements, and it seems to me part of the analysis out of the supply chain working group should be, should we invest X amount of money in ports, if the result of that would be that we would still be at a disadvantage in getting shipping or whatever to other New England ports. Best case, of course, the answer is yes, we would be at an advantage, but we need to know ahead of time before we invest in the ports that it will actually be a successful exercise. So I think that the whole supply chain question as to where Maine's particular resources can fit, how much do we have to invest to actually achieve a winning or successful position in any of those elements.
Yeah. Thanks, Tom. What a great lens for this. And I see Steve nodding his head, and I think, you know, Jonathan, yeah, that's great. All right, so that was exactly the kind of conversation I was hoping to have. Let's do it again, but on the energy market and strategies or strategy and markets working group. And thanks everybody for being willing to engage in these conversations. I'm just looking at Selena real quick to figure out whether Selena or Jeremy will be doing a 3-minute update on the energy group.
I'll do this one this morning.
Okay.
We have a couple of folks from the energy working group with us today as well, who can chime in. So we are happy to have our consultant on board. We're having a meeting of the energy working group later this afternoon. And that'll be the first time that we're delving in with the contractor to start scoping out the work in more detail. So what our initial focus on and what we will spend time on today is really looking into the offshore wind energy needs assessment work and what the long-term plans are for the Gulf of Maine, including Maine's role and needs related to energy from the Gulf of Maine. So this includes looking at what is the potential for deep water wind in the Gulf of Maine? How can offshore wind contribute to meeting the state and regional renewable energy requirements? What we anticipate from a strategic electrification load growth increase over the next 20 years or so. And then what do we think that the mix of renewable energy generation will be in Maine? And so this is initial conversation to talk through some of those variables. This is really long-term planning. So making sure that we understand what those variables are and how to make some decisions around that. We need to prioritize this work because it feeds into some of the work that the other groups are working on, including the supply chain analysis that they'll be doing. The next task that we'll be delving into is the socioeconomic analysis. And we have a longer period of time to get to do this part of the work, but we want to start it early so that we can make sure that we have sufficient time to do interviews, engage with other working groups, making sure that we're taking a holistic perspective to the extent that we possibly can, and looking at the benefits and costs associated with the scenarios that we'll put forward from an offshore wind standpoint. Beyond that, we are looking at a couple other areas, and we talked about transmission earlier today, looking at both from the onshore perspective, what it looks like to interconnect and the transmission needs associated with interconnecting offshore wind, and then also offshore, whether there are various technologies and strategies, be it coordinated transmission or otherwise, to interconnect projects, both when I look at it both from a cost perspective and a planning perspective, but also from an impact perspective. And so that's the transmission piece. The other piece is looking at from a deployment strategy, when looking at how to maximize benefits for Maine from an economic and jobs perspective. How should we think about strategically deploying offshore wind in the years ahead? So those are a few of the areas. And then I guess the overall task one that I didn't mention is what is the state of the offshore wind industry? What are cost projections? How can Maine participate from an R&D and innovation perspective when it comes to the growing floating wind area in particular, but offshore wind in general? So that will be an area that will work closely with the supply chain working group. So early conversations focusing on getting the scenarios done on the front end to help support others, other groups' work, and then delving into these other pieces that we'll do over the coming months. But again, a meeting later today at 1, which anyone's welcome to join, and happy to answer questions. And then Tom and Jeremy, if you're on, feel free to add anything if there's something that I missed too.
Thanks, Lena. That's great. I just want to, from a quick clarifications, when you all in your working group talk about deployment strategies, that refers to the way offshore wind energy would be procured and other means, right? Is that what you refer to?
Yep.
Okay. Great. Thanks. Don, you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, first I want to acknowledge that each of the working groups are obviously doing a huge lift, and I appreciate that, and particularly the process of selecting contractors takes time and whatnot. That said, this question of energy markets as context and existing energy infrastructure and bottlenecks as context really sets the entire chessboard for this discussion. And I think right now we've kind of got we've got the cart and the horse all mixed up. In a perfect world, we would have started with an overview of energy markets, energy dynamics, and the infrastructure that moves energy, because that effectively defines our opportunity set. Recognizing that there's a lot of uncertainty, but it really just defines our regional opportunity set. So I don't know what you can do to advance that, but this group ought to have an understanding, and the state ought to have an understanding of the market implications, the energy market implications for the range of investments and strategic priorities that we might develop. And until we have that context, we're each just pushing our own area of interest without the right context to think about priorities and strategy.
Thanks, Dan. Tom, do you want to follow up on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's the cart and the horse problem is going to be a perennial one here, because in a sense, each of our activities is an overlay on the others. So it's very hard to figure out exactly how you work that iterative matrix. I will say that even though if the question is how much wind power can Maine produced offshore wind turbines sell into the market, then yes, that question is going to be dominated by what the market opportunities are, what the price projections are, et cetera. On the other hand, even if it turns out that Maine doesn't have a successful strategy to sell offshore wind produced in the Gulf of Maine into the Maine market and New England market, that actually doesn't remove the value of figuring out whether there's some contribution that Maine's expertise can make into the broader market. So I don't see the question of whether or not Maine has expertise that can sell worldwide in floating turbines is actually a slightly separate question than whether you can put those turbines in the Gulf of Maine and connect them to the New England grid. So I think, when these issues come together, the questions are going to be, okay, here's the market opportunity, here's the price at which you can sell it, here's how much it's going to cost to upgrade the transmission to bring it into the market and put the turbines out there. How much does that effort increase our ability to export or get value from our expertise? And if the answer to that is, well, that's too expensive a proposition, you still may have the expertise to be able to sell. And you still may reach conclusions about, for example, Maine's ports, that even if you don't reach the decision that those ports are going to be used to float turbines out to the Gulf of Maine, there may be other utility involved. We talked about this last time about, is there other value to increasing the industrial port size in Maine? So yeah, they've got to come together. It's inelegant, but I don't suggest that anybody else stop looking at what the opportunities are to improve Maine's export, the ability of Maine to export its expertise, simply because we don't yet have the answers on the energy side. And parenthetically, those answers are incredibly fluid. I mean, they are not, it is not a static equation. You can't decide, you can't look at the situation today and say, here's how much it's going to cost in 5 years, because that number will be different, and it will be different in ways that you cannot know. So
Thanks, Tom. And
I think it's going to be a difficult iteration, but a necessary one.
I think, Tom, you're also highlighting how these working groups have overlapping questions, right? Because you're referring to questions as well that go back to what we're talking about in ports and infrastructure and everything. So that's the role of you all as an advisory committee, just to look across those different working groups. I'm glad you did. Steve, you want to go ahead? Hang on one second, Steve, you're still on mute.
Sorry, just one quick comment. For those of us who work in a marine environment on the water, it's an article of faith, almost religious faith, that ultimately it'll be cheaper to do things in floating structures than it will in fixed structures. And that's a competitive advantage that we do have here, that we've engineered and worked in that space, and we should remember that.
Thanks, Steve. Great. And I see Admiral Johnson, you have your hand up. Just before you say, we had prepped up a question here as well, in the same way we had prepped up some questions for the previous working group. And it's really trying to get where some of these comments went, which is, are we understanding the regional context sufficiently when we're looking at markets? What else do we need this working group to look at so that we are thinking in the context of all the moving pieces regionally? Admiral Johnson? There we go.
There. Well, I appreciate the comments from Don and Tom and Steve. I certainly agree with you. I do think there are two slightly different issues as Tom highlighted, but they are inextricably linked. And and I do think that, you know, the floating offshore wind power worldwide, that market is going to be immense. And everybody and people are well on the way towards it. And one of the concerns Terry had about the Jones Act and the shipping, I do know that Dominion, I believe it's Dominion Energy, is actually building a purpose-built ship that can service floating offshore wind power and get the turbines, the towers up and the turbines up and what have you. But right now, the United States doesn't have any. That issue is larger than us. But I do think that it's important to get the prototype demonstration done and the research array done, because there are possibly some significant strategic advantages to the model that has been developed for those two sites in the terms of concrete, in terms of its life expectancy, which is could be as much as 100 years, and the cost versus steel. And that could be a competitive advantage, and that becomes a additional market besides just the production of offshore wind. And I do believe that wind that sits out there, it's a resource that's untapped, a huge resource. And whether Maine makes a decision that it wants that to be part of its renewable energy goals and equation, others will. And again, that, as Tom pointed out, provides economic opportunities for us because we have a geographical advantage. Our ports are closer than anybody else's, and time and distance is money, because at the end of the day, it's going to be commercial enterprises that are going to be doing this. So I do think we have to look at it both in the context of what Maine's renewable energy requirements will be and how we're going to fill them, what the regions will be, and what are the commercial opportunities actually if somehow Maine, in addition to its own, was able to sell power, or the method that we use for our floating rigs is one that's commercially viable, not only in the rest of the United States, but worldwide. For instance, the West Coast is going to need a lot of this renewable energy, but all of it will be floating out there. And Europe has some serious challenges. It's going to be a cold winter over there. And I also think, before long, we're going to be having $4 gas here shortly. And I don't know what the price spot market for propane is going to be this winter, but it's going to be dreadfully high. So all of these will, I think, play into the equation and hopefully be an impetus, an accelerant on the sense of urgency that we need to have for this whole project. I'm taking too much time.
Thanks, Admiral Johnson. I see a few more hands. Let's take a few more comments, and then I want to make sure we leave time for the other two working groups. Patrice, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, Selena, I really appreciate the scope of what you're doing, and I agree with Don. This is just such a fundamental piece, and I think the piece that the fishing industry is really looking for to understand what this could mean for us. You may have said this, but I just wanted to clarify, does this study look at not only what Maine and the region's needs are, but what the mix of the renewable portfolio would be? Or is your work strictly looking at offshore wind in that context? So I just keep getting wrapped around the axle with how all of these pieces come together. So I was just curious about what else in Maine we would be looking at to meet the state or the region's needs and where that fits in.
Yeah, that is a great question and part of the conversation around the variables. And so and I can just explain from my experience doing the renewable portfolio assessment market assessment that we did a couple months ago. We'll do something that may or may not be exactly the same for this one, but where you look at what is the overall new load, renewable energy load that you need. And then what are the costs associated with the various renewable energy that's available, and then what that mix looks like. And so it is definitely not a science, it's an art, but trying to do various scenarios of including onshore wind, including solar, including offshore wind, looking at the costs associated with those, and having a number of scenarios that show different kind of mix of what it could be, is what we did previously, and I think might be something that we could do here too. Does that
And
help
just
answer your
a
question,
quick-
Patrice?
Yeah, it does. And just a quick follow-up to that, with that study that you referenced, I know that they used a lot of sort of southern New England ports and kind of population bases as a proxy for Maine. And I felt that those really didn't speak to what would work here. Like they had looked at, I think, where people are doing the wind development in Nantucket as, coming into that market, and kind of brought those assumptions to that transmission study here in Maine. So I hope that this will really look at our population base, our infrastructure, and not be using things from Massachusetts that I just think, it really threw off what I thought were the cost projections for some of this, because the assumptions were so flawed when you look at Maine versus someplace like Massachusetts, so that we could really kind of tighten those things up and get a more accurate picture.
Yes, definitely happy to, if there are specific pieces in particular like that, happy to have a follow-up conversation to make sure that we address those in this. I mean, it is, price projections out to 2050 are challenging and are from a global scale too. And so it is a challenge that we'll have to work through, but definitely understand the concern there.
Thanks. Will, Habib, and then let's pivot to the next set of working groups. Will, go ahead, please.
I guess with the caveat that I'm also a member of this working group, I guess responding to Don's, I think, great comments about the cold eye look at the energy market and the infrastructure. I think it's both an opportunity and a challenge, especially considering how fluid the scene appears to be at the national level, and with some of the reforms necessary at FERC. So I think, just thinking through, I as a member of this working group and somebody that's working on this has trouble, wrapping my brain around what FERC is or isn't doing on a daily basis, and what is or isn't happening at ISO. I think it would benefit this advisory group to get a little context on that in some form or another, just to get an understanding of kind of how Maine fits within that larger picture, and all of the work that could or may not happen as a result of federal action or inaction.
Thanks, Will. Yeah. Habib, last word on this? Hang on one second, Habib, you're still on mute.
Just say thank you. This has been a lot of great comments from everybody who's spoken here, but and I'd like to go to Steve Von Vogt and others' urgency comments. Where does Maine fit in? What do we have for expertise? What do we have for resources? From an urgency perspective, the other states, of course, are ahead of us in fixed bottom. They just are. They've already put targets in and they're moving way ahead of us, but not in floating. In the floating space, we are still the leaders. We are going to put in the first floater off the US coast here in under the Aquaventus project. We, of course, the research array. Thank you, Selena and Don. We are going to be the leader in that as well and get out there and do that first. So our strategic advantage over the last decade and a half has been our focus on floating. And we are a leader in that space. How do we stay there? We've talked about what do we have for energy needs in the state of Maine. The market is Maine's market and then the rest of the region's market. If you look at Maine's market, a decade ago when we had a similar committee like this, we've identified a need for 5 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity. And Don can remember that, and we unanimously voted to do that. And it's in the legislation already to go to 5 gigawatts of offshore wind as a goal, not necessarily as a requirement, but as a goal. to electrify heating and transportation in Maine. That's what it would take to electrify that. The question is, how fast can we electrify that? So that's, Selena, I think a question for your team here, as you start looking at that, is how fast can we electrify heating and transportation in Maine? That will drive the local demand. So how do you answer that question? Is a tough one, Selena, but I would hope that your team can look at that and say, how do we get there? And so that's one question. On the regional side, I've been in a number of meetings just over the last month or so about NYSERDA, for example. NYSERDA's got New York has a 9 gigawatt goal right now. The people leading that effort in NYSERDA told me just yesterday, you expect a lot more than 9 gigawatt coming out of New York. And guess what? A lot of it will be floating. Okay. Massachusetts already looking at floating in that space. Where are they going to build the floating turbines? They can't. There are no port facilities right now to build floating units anywhere in the Northeast United States. We have a unique opportunity to create not only port facilities for our market, but port facilities for their markets as well. And we have the only locations that have water depth of over 40 feet near the shore in Maine, where we can actually launch floating turbines and tow them out from shore, whether it's near Searsport or near Eastport and so on and so forth. So we have a strategic advantage from a water depth perspective to create the port facility that will not only deal with our markets, but also deal with the export, if you wish, hauls to the rest of the Northeast markets. So the question is, how do we move from an urgent perspective? So a decade ago, a committee like this said, let's go to 5 gigawatts. Could this committee right now put a down payment towards that quickly? And if I'm interested in buying a house, the way I tell people I'm interested is I put a down payment down. Could we as a committee here say, okay, can we get some legislation and to do a 1 gigawatt down payment towards a goal as we try to figure out the markets and so on and so forth? We know we need 5 in Maine alone. Can we say 1 gigawatt is a good down payment to get started? If you look at what New York has done and Massachusetts have done, Mass started with 2.4 gigawatt down payments and kept adding to it. New York started with about 6 gigawatt down payment. It's added to 9, and now they're going to add some more. So what is our down payment to get this industry going? And that's really what it's going to take, is down payment to signal to the industry, to signal to everyone, and Maine is here. So we've done a great job on Friday. I think Selena and Dan and the governor's office and all the GO to move forward and have this research array. We need to follow that up with a bigger down payment of 1 gigawatt. And I think we can figure out how to use 1 gigawatt in Maine, considering that it takes 5 gigawatts to electrify heating and transportation. So.
Thanks, Habib. Yeah, that's great. So again, working group folks, this is the kind of conversation that will come back when you bring initial recommendations back to this advisory committee. These are the kinds of things the advisory committee can be looking for. Grant, last word, and I really want to move to the next 2 working groups.
Thank you. I'll be quick. I just want to write in on what Habib said. I think it's going to be important for this working group to have the most information as soon as we can about the feasibility of which ports we're going to use, what federal money we're going to have for it, so we can make decisions about the 1 gigawatt. I think that Habib is right. The southern states are leading in fixed, but not leading in floating. And if we can know the size of the port or the market that we're going to be expanding into with guaranteed sales, if you would, or guaranteed markets for floating like Massachusetts and New York with NYSERDA, it'll allow us to make some good decisions. So again, just the first step would be the infrastructure for the ports and knowing the size that we need, so we can make some decisions about how much we're going to be able to push out of these ports.
Thanks, Grant. Okay, great. Okay, so the next 2 working groups, we wanted to do the report outs back to back and have a consolidated conversation, because there is a fair amount of overlap on some of the things that those 2 working groups will be working on, just from slightly different perspectives. So I wanted to start out, and I'm just making sure that Wing is here. You're there. Great. Hey, Wing, how's it going? Good to see you. Wing, do you want to give us the 3-minute overview of what's going on in the Environment and Wildlife Working Group? And then Terry will give us an update on fisheries, and then let's have a conversation about both of them. So Wing, over to you.
That sounds great, and good to see everybody. So as we look at our work, we're really looking at two phases. The first phase is conversations that will lead to recommendations to this group in December. And our first phase is really focused on what are the information needs from a wildlife and environment perspective to help support the state having a strong position during the discussions that will likely come up during a BOEM interagency task force. And as we have these conversations in Environment and Wildlife Group, we are strongly coordinating with the Fisheries Group and ensuring that between these two groups, we're covering all the issues and that there are synergistic conversations happening between the groups. So we've had a couple of meetings. Our most recent meeting, we had some folks from Rhode Island come and present the process that Rhode Island went through in helping support understanding wind energy areas off their coast. And I would say there were sort of two key take homes there. The first was the strong importance of early engagement from the state prior to the task force getting going, because this is the opportunity for the stakeholders here in Maine more broadly to be able to have conversations and input on what will happen at that task force. The other piece, and this will be important in the new year when we adjust to thinking about regulatory needs, is the importance of the Coastal Zone Management Act. And that will be a key nexus from a regulatory standpoint for the state to consider and see if the state is really well positioned to ensure that the state has a voice when their activity is occurring offshore. So we are now focusing on considering siting criteria first. So what for the environment and wildlife, what are the sort of key siting criteria that are needed to identify areas in the Gulf that may have the greatest conflict between offshore wind and wildlife and the environment? In that, we're also very rapidly focusing on priority species, recognizing that we can't cover everything. We are also considering and starting with the abiotic features. So what are the oceanographic features that are most critical that align both on the fisheries and wildlife side? What data do we have available to us now? And what are our data needs? And that's going to be a real focus when we come to our recommendations in the fall, or what are the data needs? So that's a quick wrap up, and my co-chair, John, is not able to be with us today at a conflict, but Laura, is there anything else that you'd like to add to that?
Thanks, Wayne. No, I think you did a super job. I guess I would just say that we've also broken the group up a little bit so that we are looking at sort of above water issues, pelagic and benthic. And I want to actually thank all the working group members for really digging into some of that work at the last meeting to start getting some information together.
Great. Okay. Super. So that's what's going on there. A lot of hard work going on in that Environment and Wildlife Working Group. Terry, do you want to walk us through what's going on with the Fisheries Working Group, which is also going to be overlapping with some of these same issues?
Yeah, sure, David. Thank you. We've met 3 times, July and twice in September. We have we're trying to schedule another meeting for mid-October. The first meeting just provided members with background on offshore wind generally, Maine's offshore wind initiative, and more detailed overview of the roadmap process. We also had a discussion of the work group's charge, goals and objectives, and reviewed how the work group would inform the advisory committee, ultimately the roadmap. At this meeting, we also had some preliminary discussions about baseline monitoring priorities for the research array. Between the first and the second meeting, we sent a survey out to the working group members to better understand their priorities and what information they'd like to have to support their work. Based on the results of that survey, Based on the results of that survey, we will better understand known and unknown impacts of offshore wind and marine habitat and species, both from the arrays themselves, but also from the transmission cables, which are important because, you know, there's not a lot of information on what happens between the research array and the shore, wherever we hook onto. And also to learn from experiences of those in other regions who are further along in the development of offshore wind and their coasts. Building off these survey results, we hosted a fisherman from Rhode Island at our second meeting. Rodman Sykes conducted the pre-construction, during construction, and post-construction trawl survey for the department, the Deepwater Wind 5 turbine array off Block Island. We had a productive and broad-ranging discussion about his observations and planted the seeds for some of our initial thinking about early recommendations related to monitoring needs. A subgroup was formed to dive into the details of that monitoring, and this group met between the second and third meeting. It included members of the Fisheries Working Group, which I am a member of that subgroup, as well as Environment and Wildlife Working Group, and some additional members of the public with important expertise. For our third meeting, we heard a report from the subgroup and reviewed some draft recommendations for baseline monitoring from the proposed Maine research array. There were some suggested revisions, and we intend to revisit the draft recommendations at the next meeting. If they advance, they will be sent to the Governor's Energy Office to inform the research array project. At the third meeting, we also discussed several draft recommendations for monitoring work that ultimately be advanced to the advisory committee. These also received some thoughtful suggestions for improvement, and we will be reviewed again at the next working group meeting. Finally, we discussed potential technical studies that might be needed to support the working group as it moves through its work. There are certainly some challenges to doing this work. First, the overlap of the research array process with the roadmap effort has made it difficult for all of us to keep the various threads clearly separated in our minds as we discuss how to move forward. Second, while the group members have asked important questions and brought critical and thoughtful lens to the discussions and are bringing forward clear ideas for recommendation, the timeline for the development of the initial set of draft recommendations of December feels ambitious given the breadth of the subject matter we hope to cover in our working group. Finally, it's a busy time of year for those who work on the water, and the industry is facing a number of major issues, right whales, stuff like that, you know, right now, and already taking a lot of time and energy away from many of the working group. Given this, we are especially grateful as co-chairs to have the strong commitment of members of the group are attending regularly, asking good, hard questions along the way, and working towards some recommendations for the roadmap. That's it for us.
Nice. Thanks, Terry. That's really helpful. I don't know, Meredith, is there anything else you want to add on to that from your perspective as co-chair?
No, I think Terry covered it. Thanks, Steve.
Great. Okay. So as you can see, there's overlap with the Environment and Wildlife Group. There's a little bit of push and pull with focusing on the research array, monitoring and research needs, in addition to the broader roadmap questions for looking at the overall Gulf of Maine. So there's some moving pieces there that are, as Terry says, hard sometimes to tease out the different aspects, but they're doing it and they're making progress. Okay. You know, we had some guiding questions here too. I don't know, just as a quick, I'm dropping them in the chat right now. As we think about how we pull all this together into a roadmap, you know, how are we pulling together the environment, wildlife, fisheries conversations into the other pieces of the puzzle? How do we think regionally here too? If you remember, Dan mentioned at the top of this call that Maine has joined a regional initiative around wildlife and monitoring and things. So I just invite reactions to what you're hearing from these two working groups and how it can really strengthen the overall work of this roadmap. Anything that we want to react to from Terry and Wing in the work of these working groups? Or questions? Admiral Johnson?
Well, I'd like to thank both Wing and Terry for their excellent reports. And found them very interesting, and both of you, a critical part of the important work you're doing is going to be the whole issue of monitoring and what should we monitor, and that's going to take resources, what have you. So I think that that's critically important. One thing I had on my list, I think Terry, you mentioned it, is I don't know if the right phrasing is, but the electromagnetic characteristics of underwater cables, as it might impact fishing and wildlife and what have you. I don't know if we've got a study or if there's information available that can help us definitively determine if there are any impacts. And of course, if there are impacts, are they negative impacts? But I think it's going to take both on wildlife stocks, both fisheries and birds and what have you. Monitoring is going to be especially important, and monitoring and a coherent, well thought out strategy with regard to monitoring is going to go a long way to building trust and buy-in by our stakeholder groups. So thank you for what you're doing in this area, and this is going to be very important to us to get to my goal of having actionable recommendations when this is all said and done. Thanks.
Thanks, Admiral Johnson. Tom Welch.
Yeah, thanks. And I again, this may be implicit in what the chairs were describing, but it seems to me that when the work of those groups comes into the broader group and is folded into the overall recommendations, it would be nice to have some categorization of impacts. In other words, there may be some impacts that are totally unacceptable under any circumstances. There would be some impacts that we can live with a little bit if certain mitigations are taken, and there are some impacts that the groups are relatively indifferent to. So because I think that once you begin to put everything together and try to make some decisions about how Maine's resources should be invested, it will be useful to have more than just a "we don't like this, please don't do it" kind of answer. It would be useful to have someone say, yeah, we don't really like this, but there are certain efforts that could be undertaken to mitigate it enough so that we can live with it. So there are sort of three categories. One is must have, one is would like to have, one is can sort of live either way with it. And I think if the groups start thinking about the implications of the various things that their particular interests, that will be a useful input into the broader group.
Thanks, Tom. Meredith?
Thanks. Yeah, I appreciate the suggestion, Tom. I think the challenge there is that at the end of the day, we don't know what a lot of the impacts will be. We really don't have the information that we need to assess those things. So I think there is a fair amount of concern about the timeliness and order of events in which we actually can obtain that information and make those assessments. So I think, the critical part here is getting some of this work underway as soon as possible so that we can start to understand those impacts. But regardless, and obviously, we do things all the time that we don't know the future and we can't see where things are headed. But I want to caution a little bit from oversimplifying. I think some of these issues are really complex and have long-term ramifications that we may not be able to understand prior to construction.
Thanks. Terry, then Wing, and then let's round this up.
Yeah, so, we had Rodman, when he came to our second meeting there, he was great. What we came out of that meeting with, my take on it was, the monitoring part of his work he did post construction, because something's going on in southern New England. The lobster fishery around the array isn't great. The heron fishery around the array isn't great now, but they aren't surveying that area afterwards to any. I think they did it. Correct me if I'm wrong, Meredith. They only did it 1 year afterwards, and now the fishing's changed. The migratory patterns or whatever of the fish have changed in that area. So I think it's extremely important for this advisory panel to come up with a recommendation to have a strong monitoring plan after construction. So thank you.
Thanks, Terry. Wing?
Yeah, this is a great conversation. And one thing, I have a squirmy puppy on my lap, so sorry if I'm distracted. So regarding monitoring, I think one thing that's helpful is to consider the types of information you need on the siting side from a characterization of the Gulf of Maine. So one of the key things you want to consider is avoidance and having the baseline data in order to understand and support siting. And then you have a second set of data needs that will come on the monitoring side once a project is built. And those often you really need different types of efforts and different kinds of research design in collecting that data. And then to Tom's point, one thing that we are considering is there's a lot of diversity in the Gulf of Maine, and we need to focus on the species that are most vulnerable from a population perspective. So that's one of our conversations that we had at our meeting last time, was which populations are going to be most critical. And then importantly, of those populations that are most important, which ones do we know are vulnerable to offshore wind? From a bird perspective, less so on the marine mammal side, large marine mammals, there's been a lot of research in Europe that can really help us guide us on what are sort of the critical species here to be focused on. And so that's part of what we're considering as we consider criteria for siting.
Thanks, Wayne. That's really helpful. Okay, great. So I think let's leave it there. We actually ran this over in time a bit because I felt like it was a great conversation. Again, you as an advisory committee, you'll be receiving these things, these ideas from the working groups as initial recommendations starting as early as December. So this is our mindset is like, let's get ready to receive these ideas. Let's make sure we're giving the working group signals about what we want to receive. Terry, last word.
Yeah, so maybe towards the end of the meeting, we can have a conversation about that timeline of December, because we're really feeling the pressure in our working group. I mean, we have a lot of technical crap to go through, so just have that conversation anyway.
I'm glad. Yes. Thank you for flagging that. And indeed, it is a conversation, and stay tuned because yes, there's going to be a January meeting, folks. So I'll just warn you about that. Okay. But yes, timeline, let's get into it. I think let's go to the next piece, which actually is going to have a piece around timeline as well. And that is this sort of roadmap framework, and which translates also into a kind of template for the recommendations that we're asking the working groups to produce. And Stephanie Watson will be walking us through this. So Stephanie, I'm happy to share my screen as you walk through this, and just let me know when to move forward. I'll pull it up in just a sec.
Yeah, great. Thanks, David.
We had this slide as well, Stephanie, as we got going to remind everybody on the back end of this conversation, like you as advisory committee members, you can and should stay involved through attending working group meetings, providing feedback directly to the co-chairs, and feel free to always reach straight out to Geo, whether that's Stephanie, Selena, Dan, or others. So we just always want to remind you, please do stay engaged as we go forward. Okay, here we go.
Okay,
Stephanie.
Great. This is just a slide you've all seen before, just reiterating the 4 goals for the Maine Offshore Wind Initiative and the roadmap. And I think we've heard a reflection of all of these 4 goals in our discussion today. So that seems like a really good sign. Next slide, David. Okay, on this slide, we're going to walk through a little bit about the proposed roadmap structure and a template for the working group recommendations. There was some information on this in your pre-meeting reading packet, and I hope you all had a chance to read it. If you didn't, then hopefully you'll have a chance to read it after this meeting. For those of you that are on the phone and not on the advisory committee, David and Maggie provided a link in the chat where you can access the pre-meeting materials as well. So with this in the next few slides, we're proposing a structure for the roadmap and a process for developing recommendations. And we'd like to hear your feedback on both of those things. First, I'm going to walk through this slide and then sketch an example of how a working group can craft recommendations to support these 6 objectives in a set of actions. Third, then we'll discuss the process for the working groups to present their recommendations to you, the full advisory committee, for feedback. And then finally, we'd like to hear your input on this whole proposed structure and process. So on this slide, we're proposing 6 objectives for the roadmap to collectively support the 4 goals across the top. And these objectives come from a review of the working group work plans that the co-chairs and their members have developed to date. Also based on stakeholder feedback on Maine offshore wind through the research array process and otherwise. Also from the Maine Ocean Energy Task Force report and a review of other states' offshore wind plans. So the 6 objectives that we're proposing for your feedback are first, to set data-driven procurement goals for offshore wind development. Again, something we've been hearing about today. The second, to improve the governance framework for offshore wind development to sustain Maine's maritime heritage and the Gulf of Maine environment. Again, something we've been hearing about today. Promoting and supporting continued development of a renewable offshore wind industry, ports, infrastructure, related businesses, workforce, and STEM education. The 4th objective is to plan for and implement energy infrastructure needs. Again, something we're hearing about today. Maximizing benefits of offshore wind for Maine and fostering regional collaboration as the 5th proposed objective. And then the 6th, to reduce costs and minimize the potential impacts of offshore wind. So those are the 6 proposed objectives, all collectively supporting the 4 goals listed across the top. Next slide, David. Okay. So this is an example of the general structure for the recommendations. The structure hopefully will be helpful to the working groups as they prepare the recommendations. So each working group is comprised of the experts and they will have this proposed structure to help frame up their recommendations to support those 6 objectives proposed for the roadmap. Under each recommendation, the working groups will identify specific action steps to implement that recommendation. And so this is an example of a rhetorical or hypothetical example for objective 1, promoting and supporting continued development of an offshore wind industry, ports, related businesses, workforce, and STEM education in Maine. That's actually another number on the previous slide, but this was one of the 6 essential objectives proposed for the roadmap. Underneath this objective, there might be a set of recommendations. In this case, advancing offshore wind training for Maine workers, developing and supplying adaptive training to Maine workers to transfer skills to well-paying secure jobs in offshore wind. Under that recommendation, there would be a set of actions. And then for each action, the working group could try to answer questions related to how it contributes to Maine's efforts to develop a responsible and cost-effective offshore wind industry, who would be involved, equity questions around the action, when to implement, what's required to implement it, and how will success be measured. Next slide, David. So this is just a refresher of the roadmap timeline and milestones that we presented, I think, back in July as well. And just to recall from that first meeting that we hope to have initial recommendations from the working groups to the full advisory committee for December or maybe January. As Terry was saying before, December is ambitious target, but we'd still like to try to do what we can by that time. There will be iterative opportunities for additional refinements to those recommendations based on feedback through the next 9 months of the process of developing the roadmap. Next slide. So specifically what this means for the process between the working groups and the advisory committee. As the advisory committee, you're the consultative body with additional expertise that you can add to the recommendations generated by the working groups. So this slide and the next slide actually outline the proposed process for working groups to bring their recommendations to you, the full advisory committee, for feedback. In phase one, this is through December of this year or January of 2022. The working groups will be presenting their initial recommendations to the full advisory committee. I could walk through the steps here, but I know we're pressed for time. Generally, the working groups will present their initial recommendations to the advisory committee. The advisory committee can ask clarifying questions, offer refinements, identify areas of potential misalignment between working groups' recommendations, and identify gaps across the working group recommendations. Then the hope is the working groups could make quick refinements, and then we'll put the initial recommendations out to proactive stakeholder and public outreach for feedback. The next slide, just iterating to the subsequent phases 2, 3, and 4. So phase 2 from January to June 2022, there would be potentially proactive public and stakeholder engagement from the initial recommendations. Then the working groups revise those based on that feedback and specifically demonstrating how that feedback was incorporated, which we think is really important to show how the stakeholders' input is being considered as we progress through the roadmap process. The revised recommendations may also have to take into account new information that we learn along the way. The advisory committee will review the progress of the working groups in March or April, and then present final recommendations in June. July to December of 2022 is phase 3. That's where we at GEO start doing an awful lot of work, consolidating recommendations into the draft roadmap, engaging the working groups and the advisory committee and the public to review, and then finalizing that roadmap finally to communicate that and implement it beyond 2022. So that is a proposed structure and a proposed process, and we look forward to hearing some feedback from all of you. I have seen very recently, there's some feedback that both Grant and Tom provided to us, and thank you very much for that. You're welcome to also to share your thoughts with the group here today. So here are a couple of questions. For those of you that are active on the working groups, do you see your work represented in these objectives? For everyone on the advisory committee, are these objectives giving us the core of our roadmap? Is the timeline clear and appropriate? And what other guidance do we want to give working groups at this stage? So I'll open that up to discussion, and David, if you don't mind facilitating, that'd be great.
Happy to. Great. Okay. All right. So we're getting our minds around what a draft or what this roadmap could look like and what that means in terms of the components that we're building through the working groups, and then you all as an advisory committee looking across. So I see some comment in the chat, and I think the chat is a great place. I invite folks, just for efficiency's sake, drop stuff in the chat quickly if you have some reactions. Suzanne, go ahead, please.
Thanks. And I've got a couple of things. So Stephanie, I'm sorry I didn't follow up with you before this, but I may follow up with some stuff in writing. I guess some small things and some bigger overarching comments. First, I took a look at the template. I thought that was pretty helpful to be able to see. And I know, having gone through the Climate Council process with a lot of you, it was really helpful to have that guidance of how to actually form a recommendation. I think this maybe piggybacks a little bit on Will's comment. But one of the thoughts that I had with the template itself was whether or not we could add a question around additional needs for data or research, or in some cases, you know, where more information is needed. And sometimes that's actually going out and talking to people. I know we're still learning about the goals for the research consortium, and that sounds like a really great complementary initiative for this work, but there's so many other folks out there in the world that are trying to help us close the gaps of where information is needed. And I just feel like it would be helpful in each of these recommendations to know where additional information might be helpful to the extent that others in this space could help to close those gaps, either with the research consortium or outside of it. So that's one of the sort of smaller pieces on the template itself. Yeah, I think I hear Terry on the really ambitious timeline here. And again, sort of drawing parallel to the Climate Council process and how long we took to come up with those draft recommendations. It seems like this is a quicker process than that. And so I think what I heard Stephanie say is, you know, this is iterative, and you sort of see that longer timeline between January and June, when it seems like there's could be a lot of good discussion happening there as well. I think it would just be helpful to understand to what extent new feedback can be surfacing during that time as opposed to iterative. I wouldn't want working groups to feel like they've really got to surface everything by December and then tweak it. My guess is that there may be, through this learning process, entirely new recommendations that emerge. And so I think it'd be helpful to understand if to the extent that that is going to be permissible and doable, just to send that message of flexibility. And yeah, I guess just one last, sorry to take the floor, but I feel like this is kind of the major place for me to weigh in on all of this. The last overarching piece, that a bigger picture piece that I wanted to bring up, is that this engagement process is so important to have sort of the feeling like the outcome is as good as the process is good, you know, that helps with the getting to the outcome. Oftentimes that's what we say, is that the outcome is only as good as the process that led to it. So I would just ask, and you don't have to answer this now, but I feel like before we go into this January process of actively seeking engagement, I think it would be really helpful for us as an effort, as a group, as a roadmap effort, to really put down in writing what we feel like are the core tenets of successful stakeholder engagement for this topic in Maine. I know David and Laura and their work well, and have a lot of respect for it, and know that what they're designing is going to be thoughtful and effective. But I think it would benefit all of us if we could spend a little time actually putting in writing sort of what, I don't want to call it rules of engagement, that sounds a little too formal, but can we ask maybe each working group for input on what is the best way to engage their stakeholder groups for feedback in offshore wind? And as I think I said in one of the first meetings, you know, can we be candid about what hasn't served us well in this space, and what has made it difficult in the engagement process over the last decade or so? And can we figure out what it is we want to pull forward that has been really helpful and constructive in getting stakeholder feedback on all of this? So I don't know to what extent that that's actually really included in the work plan for all of this, but I think as we put forward a roadmap for, you know, the future of what this looks like in Maine, I think it would be really helpful for us to, you know, document that, get some feedback on it, kind of document it, use it in this roadmap process to get feedback on the recommendations, but to actually also have it, you know, in our back pockets as we move forward in all the adjacent processes around offshore wind in Maine. So that's my probably more like 25 cents, but I hope that's helpful.
Thanks, Suzanne. And those are really useful points, as we're going to have one more conversation in a moment about stakeholder engagement specifically. So I want to carry those forward, Suzanne, as well into that, to make sure we're addressing what you're saying. Yeah. Okay. Are there other reactions? Thanks for the comments in the chat. It looks like it's interesting in the chat. We see the specific things Will's saying about research and monitoring, being more explicit about that. We look at the tension between regional collaboration and the competitive nature of this. And so how are we thoughtful about how we're expressing that in the roadmap, that there are opportunities for regional collaboration and success and benefit? And there's a competitive nature to some of this too. Admiral Johnson, go ahead, please.
Thank you, David. Stephanie, thanks for that brief, and Suzanne, thanks for those comments. A couple things. This goes back to the comment I think Tom made. Not all recommendations are equal. So I think for the working groups, I think it might be very helpful, and maybe we should give you some guidance, but there are going to be some that are absolutely critical, or at least from the working group, and then we'll have the overall advisory committee take a look, and because not everything can be critical and not everything is critical. But there are certainly lots of them that will be nice to have, and we want to make sure they're addressed. And then there's some that, yeah, this is interesting and we should note it, but we can live with it. So some kind of a matrix like that, so that not all recommendations are going to be equal from every single working group. You're going to have many more recommendations than I think will end up in the critical pile. So I think that was a good point that Tom brought up. The other thing is, Suzanne, you're absolutely right. The whole point of a deliberative process such as we've set up is that we will benefit and grow from it and gain wisdom collectively from the input of all the people who are part of it. And I'm a strong believer. It's actually fundamental to the democratic processes that runs our nation, is this deliberative process. And we will be better because of it. And you're right, things will mature. We'll have better viewpoints, or we're not doing our job if we don't mature and grow through this process. So I think that's a very good point that you brought up. And the final thing is that, yes, each one of the working committees should help us and make sure that we have been inclusive in identifying and reaching out to stakeholders. And so I appreciate that comment. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Admiral Johnson. Okay. We want to talk about equity, and we want to do one more look at the stakeholder engagement. I will mention on the timeline that's come up a couple points. You're going to hear shortly from us that we're going to add a meeting of you all, advisory committee, in late January. And the reason we're doing that is we recognize that even initial recommendations will be hard for some groups to get on the table by December 14th, or a few days before December 14th, so we can review it as an advisory committee. So expect in your calendars a meeting in late January, and that's a recognition that even initial recommendations, some of them will be hard to get on the table by December 14th. And so, Terry, I don't know if that totally solves the issue, but I think, giving more time for the initial piece, and then as Suzanne said, that isn't the end of the story. That's enough so we can go out and proactively talk to folks. We also recognize that you'll continue to do your work and even develop whole new recommendations. That's okay, right? But we need to get a set of initial things ready to go by the winter, so that in February, we're able to head out and start to have some conversations with broader communities across the state. Okay, so speaking of broader communities across the state, we had sent ahead as a pre-read some ideas on equity. And this is a kind of, it's one of those challenges because it's become something of a buzzword, and there's a lot of meaning behind it. So we wanted to be clear what we're talking about, and what this process is talking about around this word equity, and around the intent behind it. We're not going to go through all of that material in the pre-read, which included examples from other states, specific examples, what Massachusetts is doing, what New York, what others around the issue of equity and equitable outcomes. Interesting work around low-income ratepayers, interesting work around race. And so those are examples to take a look at. What we are going to look at right now, and I should be sharing my screen, are a set of proposed questions that we think that the working groups and you all as an advisory committee could really make core questions into your work, right? When you're talking about monitoring, or you're talking about jobs, or you're talking about who's involved in this process, we're looking at these questions. Let me just say a word about them for a sec. The first set of questions is about understanding the positive and potentially negative impacts of what we are recommending, right? And really trying to leverage positive impacts in an equitable way. So that first piece is, how do our recommendations, or how can our recommendations support the talents of all Maine people, attract and build a diverse workforce in Maine, right? And proactively address what we could consider to be existing inequities. And I'll say a word about that phrase in just a second. The second piece is, how can we avoid or mitigate any potential negative impacts from recommendations that we might come up with that could disproportionately affect some groups over others. Okay, this really is hearkening back to what Suzanne McDonald was saying in our last meeting about understanding core ideas about who these key groups are we need to keep in our minds. And the final question is what Suzanne called procedural equity, which is a good phrase. And it's about who's involved, right? Who's involved in this process? And has this process provided a space for the groups and communities that really have a stake in it? And those could include low-income communities that, electricity and energy costs are a big piece of their energy burden. It can include all kinds of other folks that maybe aren't well represented in this group or in the working groups. And what are we doing about that? These are core questions we'd like the working groups to take on, and we'd like you as the advisory committee to be looking at as well. Let me show two other things real quickly. We think it's important because there's some, not fully shared definitions about what's referred to when we talk about existing inequities or quote, communities that aren't typically included in these conversations. We think it would be helpful if a handful of you would want to work with GEO and also with the Governor's Office of Policy Innovation in the future on helping to have a shared definition right away, in the next couple of weeks, so that the working groups have some shared language they're working on here and there isn't confusion around that. We think we can do that relatively quickly, but it's important that we do that across the board, across the working groups. And then finally, we hope the working groups take this on and that you as the advisory committee say, yep, I want to see that from working groups. Show me how you answered those questions and did that analysis. You'll see in the template that Stephanie shared, there is a question there. Talk to me about how this is equitable. In terms of next steps on this, we're hoping that you all as an advisory committee today can say, yep, it feels like the right questions, feels like we're headed in the right direction. And then encouraging you to be part of the groups that build definitions, be champions of these questions in the working groups. And overall, we all have, because this is a merging space around equity, understanding what's going on nationally, globally, with our regional peers is important work that we all need to do to build our knowledge. Okay, let me stop there and say that's what we're hoping to do around equity. And let me just test with folks. Maybe you can even just drop it in the chat of, yes, sounds good, or yes, I have this concern. Let's do that right now quickly in the chat. Feel free to raise your hand as well if there's some reaction you're having when you see me present this or when you read it as the pre-read. So I invite you to put in the chat, sounds good, on the right track, or this is my concern. And then also if you want to raise your hand and say a word, we have a few moments here to discuss this, particularly if you feel like we're heading down the wrong road with this. Reactions? Yeah. Thanks to Will's got a great point. And this is something if Geo wants to mention what's been going on there with the tribal representation. Tom, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it is a good list. I think it's worth noting that not every action that might come out of this group would have either a positive or negative effect on the unrepresented groups. So there could be some null sets. But I think that having each group ask the question, here are the categories of unrepresented groups or disadvantaged groups, and here is what we think might or might not be the implications. And I think there's sort of three categories there. One is it could hurt, it could be neutral, or it could actually produce some positive benefit in the following particular way. So I think just sort of putting a little framework around it and having that as an overlay on the working group's recommendations would probably serve what you're looking for.
Thanks, Tom. That's helpful. Yeah. Suzanne?
I was trying to type and listen at the same time, so I figured really I would just say it. I think this is really great. It's really informed by, I think, the process we went through the Climate Council of how we can kind of get this stuff in at the outset and give some guidance. So I think it's really great. Yeah, just a small little nuance. I just think there's an interesting thing in there around this concept of sort of current users, current impact, and absolutely yes to that. But how do we represent this piece around historic marginalization and how sort of current access and use might have been shaped in part by that? And so just a little bit more detail in that sense. And I think to that point, just a +1 to Will's question around, representation within this group that I know we flagged. So an update on that would be great as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Suzanne. Thanks for those who are dropping in the chat. Those are great suggestions. I don't know, folks from GEO, do you want to just say a word about tribal representation right now because of the questions, or that's something we can get back to the group with as well? But I'm just looking around who's on the call right now.
Hey, David, I'm here.
Yeah. Hi, Selena. Yeah.
So definitely recognize the concern and question. We're still working through it and wanting to make sure that we have the right representation on this advisory committee. So no update today, but certainly something that we're working through.
Thanks, Selena. That's helpful. Will, Neil, and then we'll talk about engagement.
Yeah, I just want to, I guess, be a little bit more explicit about my flag, which is especially for the port infrastructure group and thinking through if any movement happens in Eastport in particular, ensuring that working group is really considering both the opportunities and potential drawbacks for the Passamaquoddy people up there.
Thanks, Will. Thanks for the clarification. Neil?
Just a note on the tribal representation. MMA does have affiliate status with most tribal groups in the state, and they've been included in our communications. MMA internally is going to actually create an offshore wind, subcommittee, of which they will be invited to participate and sit in on. So there's an opportunity there, but obviously much larger consideration from this group would be great as well.
Thanks, Neil. That's good to know. Very helpful. Okay, let's talk about, thanks everyone for this. And obviously, please reach out to all of us, whether it's Laura and me and the facilitation team or Geo, about these issues if you have additional thoughts. Laura, do you want to walk us through what we're thinking in terms of engagement? It's nice that Suzanne and others have kind of teed us up for this conversation. I'll share my slides. You tell me when you want to move forward.
Sure. So thank you, Suzanne. No surprise. And indeed, our process is designed to have the working groups do just that, as well as the advisory committee, to help give us feedback on. And I think in our pre-read, we had questions for the advisory committee in terms of making sure we're reaching stakeholders and suggestions on who some of those organizations should be. By design, we've already have nearly 100 key stakeholders in just the working groups and in the advisory committee. And so walking beyond those, you can take. So I was just quickly on this slide. As you've seen this before, this is sort of our overall circles of engagement. If you want to just go to the next slide, David. It's important to note we really want to talk to a variety of stakeholders about what we're doing, why we're creating the roadmap, and seek feedback at various points. And so it really will be a product that reflects the broad range of what Maine people have to offer and incorporates additional expertise and the best available information, as well as making sure what comes out and those recommendations are really understood by Maine citizens. Why are we thinking about going down this road, and what have you considered? And in order to have a product that really is supported by Mainers and reflects Maine's values as a whole. So I, like you, Suzanne, think this work is particularly important. And the targeted, in the next slide, David, for some of the targeted outreach, beyond the advisory committee, beyond the working groups, the targeted outreach are really people that aren't well represented on the working groups or might be represented on the working groups but have some broader constituencies, specific experts who have valuable insight. And some of the working groups are already calling some of those people into their work. and people that will be instrumental in the implementation. So that's what we've thought about, sort of some of those targets. And there are many ways that we're working towards developing ways to reach those folks, including inviting them, obviously, to working group meetings in particular. We're looking to host some targeted meetings, ideally in conjunction with either an advisory committee or working group member that has connections with those stakeholders. Also participating in events that will be hosted by those groups, regular meetings, for example, of MMA, and it could come and do some targeted outreach. And there's opportunities online for, as David has mentioned, online feedback and working directly through some of our partner organizations for that targeted type of outreach. Next slide, David. And you've seen this before, you've even seen it today, but I think, it's important, when will some of this happen? Some of it's happening right away. So we have an active website up for the public, and we have opportunities for commenting feedback there. We have a newsletter that is periodically going out to remind people and making sure that people trying to make sure that we're current and have people having access to agendas and summaries and understanding the work that's already rolling along. After we get these initial recommendations in December/January, we'll plan on some more proactive engagement that goes out to the broader public through our website and through some meetings with those targeted stakeholders. Then once we bring those back in and get that sort of next set in July, we'll have another round of proactive engagement that will also include some, hopefully in person, some broad public meetings as well, to bring people into the fold who have been hearing about this, hopefully seeing it on the web, but maybe even get to hear in person what that final package of recommendations look like, and provide input so that input can be considered by the advisory committee before producing the final report in the fall. And I think I just ran through that as quickly as I could, David. So we had a couple questions that we wanted to pose to you. One of the things that I did have, I guess this is my slide for the sort of our next steps, which would, following up on this, we'll send out some kind of form or format for you all to help assist us in identifying who those party stakeholders are for targeting engagement in the broad community outreach, as well as for helping us figure out the best pathways for engaging those stakeholders, maybe the best forums and the best approaches. And also we look to you to help disseminate information directly to your networks as products are produced that are important that we're getting feedback on. So we're looking at both the advisory committee and the working groups, and we'll have explicit conversations with the working groups in the near future about helping us make sure the folks that they're representing on those working groups, how do we reach their broader networks, and who's not on that working group that we need to make sure we are reaching as we produce some results and have these conversations. So I think that was it. David, do we have time for a few comments here?
Yeah, for sure. And I want to mention one thing that wasn't on the slides, which is once we have a sort of package of initial recommendations coming out of the working groups, which will be by the end of January kind of thing, we will be updating the website with that material and with some additional tools like some little online surveys and or a better comment portal, so that the website is also a helpful tool in that proactive piece that we'll be doing over the winter. Okay. So you heard that. You've heard it in the context of equity work. You've heard it in the context of the sort of what we're looking to construct for a roadmap. Any final reflections folks have, feel free to use the chat like Grant just did. Thanks, Grant, with the comment on the trades. Feel free to use the chat, raise your hand. Any final parting thoughts as we sort of pull this whole thing together in our heads about content, about equity, about engagement? Suzanne, go ahead, please.
I'm not gonna be shy.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that we think about in the sort of equity and inclusion space in the process of the sort of going to stakeholders and creating these sort of finite periods of opportunity to become expert in what it is people are asking for and to be able to respond, in the moment on the spot. And I know we've talked about this in the Climate Council and particularly with the equity subcommittee work there, which is just to what extent when we're going to stakeholders can we indicate that this is the beginning? It's clearly not the beginning on any of this. The state's been doing this work for a very long time, but to clarify that that this is sort of a point in time of a continuing and ongoing discussion. Everybody kind of comes with their own timeline and set of needs and boxes to tick, whether it's the lease process or the roadmap process or an individual project and developer. And I think that can feel really hard if this is not your day job and you don't sit and think about this all day and you're not expert, to feel like you're just sort of helping somebody tick their box. And so I guess it would be neat if a recommendation came through this process that was about how the state can clarify its role in continuing to provide ongoing opportunities for stakeholder feedback and input. So that might be a recommendation that we bring. It's not sort of there already, but I just think as we approach people to help them understand that, this isn't this finite opportunity of the be all end all of what you say, because I just think if we're approaching people and really want to have meaningful feedback, you may not get it in a short period of time. So just understanding to what extent that can be indicated, knowing that this is just one project, but I think that would really help in terms of, bringing folks to the table and having their input be valued.
Nice framing on that. Laura, do you want to react to that?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and I think it's one reason why having sort of that initial something in the winter, so get people's head around this whole topic who have been just hearing little bits and pieces but don't really know what's going on. As you all have experienced, everyone's at a different level. So that's sort of like one initial sort of push out of something's happening. Here's what these groups are, and then allowing more of that to trickle down and have another opportunity later, which I totally agree is not the end, certainly, of these conversations on offshore wind, and helping people begin to understand the various pieces will be important part of those conversations as well, because it's complex.
Yeah, to what extent can we say even beyond the roadmap that there is this opportunity, which is hard because we are only the roadmap. But I think that's, what's kind of nice about some of the Climate Council work, where there's these 3-year commitments to follow up on this. And so we're trying to come up with recommendations there, and we're going out for stakeholder feedback right now on those equity recommendations. How can we say, well, we're going to keep coming back and asking. And I think it's that commitment to ongoing engagement that I hope will be really helpful, and just understand it's constrained with the scope of work for the roadmap. But I think it would be helpful if we could send a message around those lines and make that commitment to ongoing dialogue.
Thanks, Suzanne. Great. So Tom, perhaps last word on this, although I do encourage people to drop in the chat if you're having some other reaction. I'm looking at that going on. Tom, last word, and I know we're at the top of the hour here.
Yeah, just a quick thing. I mean, I think it'd be very helpful to have some guidance on what it is that you say to people that you're trying to get engaged. Because if you go to them and say, what do you think of this project? The answer you get will not be useful, because they will not have enough information to have a coherent statement. If you go to the people and say, what is important to you generally, it may be just too general, or it'll be useful input. So finding some way of eliciting what their important issues and imperatives are in a way that will be useful to feed into this project, I think is the most useful question, but it's a complicated one. And I think if someone can give some thought to exactly how should you phrase it when you go to an underrepresented community or a high school student, in order to get something that is actually useful to the process.
That's a great point. That is a really good point. Thanks, Tom. And that is absolutely what we'll be doing, is trying to frame this up in a way that feels constructive. Okay, it's top of the hour. So the final thing we wanted to do was just next steps. I think I've given a little preview of some of the next steps. Not in addition to our December 14th meeting, expect 2 invites in your email box from us, which will be a quick, like a 1-hour check-in in November, just sort of so we don't lose each other, don't lose the thread with each other. And then expect probably on January 29th, a longer meeting to pick up from the working groups, additional initial recommendations that just weren't ready by December 14th. So expect those 2 dates to come through from us. I'll turn it over to your co-chairs, Admiral Johnson, to close off our meeting today.
Thank you, David. With regard to the next meetings you were just bringing up, I did want to add that I think it is important, hopefully by the 14th and the 29th of January. I don't know if every meeting has to be in person, but I think the sooner we can have an in-person meeting, the better. I just think that we can get to know each other, and besides looking at a screen. And so depending on COVID and what have you, and I know logistics becomes more difficult, we'll probably always have at least a hybrid option. Those can join in person, be there in person. And then those that are from greater distances or have schedule challenges, we don't want to preclude you if you can't be there in person. But I think there is some merit in getting together and getting to know each other a little bit. And I just thought today was a great meeting, and I appreciate the participation on everybody. Again, going back to the very first meeting, you know, I'm a big believer in the power of deliberative processes. And although, you know, it can't just be talk, there has to be some action at the end of the day. But it's very important to bring together, and I believe that we'll always have a better output because we're spending this time in this deliberative process. So I appreciate the effort that everybody put into making this a productive and meaningful meeting, and look forward to, again, there are ongoing working group meetings always, and then of course our next meeting. Are we having a little 1-hour thing in November?
In November. We'll schedule that up. It'll be just short. Yeah.
And that'll be a Zoom meeting, and then possibly the 14th will be another one of these longer meetings. And that could very well be in person. But that's all I have for today. Thank you all very much.
Great. Well, thanks, everybody. Let's end it there. We really appreciate the engagement today. The actions now in the working groups, be engaged in those working groups if you're not already. Expect some of this communication from us. As Laura said, we're going to send you probably some requests as well to help think through some of the engagement work. That's it for me. Take care. Have a great rest of your day. And we'll see you in a little bit, if not in the working group meetings. Take care, everybody. Thanks for everyone who joined us today online. Again, the website's a great way to channel in some input, participate in working group meetings. You're welcome to observe those as well. And there's often public comment. Take care, folks. All the best.
Thanks, everyone.